What's your considered view about the state of political journalism in the light of the expenses saga?
Well, I think it is absolutely true that journalists in general are among the most incurious people in the world, and that it is one of the most startling characteristics of them. I'd always realized this, and then I read Nigel Williamson's wonderful book, The Wimbledon Poisoner, in which a huge number of fictional journalists descend upon Wimbledon in the middle of a murder case and come away having learned absolutely nothing, because they all knew before they went there what the story was, which is, of course, what we do. But in the case of political journalists, it's even worse than that. They are there, sitting in the middle of the factory which produces legislation, and they know nothing about it. And I realized after what felt like 8 years, and was, I think, 4, working down at Westminster, that I couldn't remember having attended a single debate to the end, that I was astonished to discover how many bills had been passed while I'd been there, with amazingly wide effect, of which I'd known nothing at the time. I read them now, usually on the web, and I think, good heavens, that went through Parliament while I was working in the lobby, and I didn't even know. And this seemed to me to be worth recording. The business about the expenses, certainly when I was there, it was well known to everybody that a large number of MPs were employing their spouses as their secretaries, and this was the scandal. The arrangement which now exists hadn't begun. But I think that for everyone to pretend that this is an immense surprise to Fleet Street is, how should I say, a little exaggerated.
What is your general assessment of the state of our democracy and the state of our Fourth Estate's ability to hold that democracy to account?
I think the real thing that's been lost, and it's been lost in my lifetime, is the adversarial element. And I don't know where it comes from, whether it's Norman and Saxon, or whether it's Roundhead and Cavalier, or whether it's North and South, but there has always been, until very recently in our Parliament, and it's been crucial, a rivalry, and to some extent even a personal dislike between the two sides, which has meant that they, like two magnets, they can't come together. Circumstances force them apart, that they view everything that the other one does critically, that the opposition genuinely, quite often quite personally and passionately, used to view everything the government did as suspect, which is a very good thing to do with any government anyway. It's my view that Parliament should have a permanent standing committee on unintended consequences, which would examine every piece of legislation on the basis that it's been drawn up by idiots. But a proper hostile opposition performs some of this function. But the absence of the adversarial relationship between the two parties also turns politics into a kind of neutral. I heard Gordon Brown describe it as a profession today, as if you could take an exam in politics like an accountant. It's not a profession, it's a trade like what we do. And it's more disreputable because they get paid by the public through the taxpayer, whereas we have to scribble on the backs of advertisements. And it has become a trade in which people actually set out from their early years to make a career. And what could be more inconvenient in the midst of a career to have to make a stand on principle, to have to annoy somebody, to have to upset anybody's apple cart? You're not going to want to do it. Who are they working for? Are they working for the people who elect them, or are they working for the whips?
Just set out in a few minutes, if you would, in a broader context, in a more sort of social context, your thesis about conventional wisdom and the damage therein.
Well, conventional wisdom is always wrong. It's what people used to think when they first had a bright idea about what was going on, and by the time it's become accepted, let's go back for a moment. Somebody decides that it's the case, for instance, that New Labour is right-wing. Now, this is an absurd proposition and doesn't withstand a moment's examination, but it is conventionally believed by almost all political commentators, all journalists covering politics, and most of the people who listen to them. If you actually examine New Labour, it has been probably the most radical government in this country since Oliver Cromwell. In constitutional terms, in economic terms, in terms of foreign policy, it has done the most extraordinarily radical things, and what's more, in the area of social and moral politics, which have been very important to it. It has overturned huge numbers of things which had seemed to be absolutely permanent. And yet it is conventional wisdom that New Labour is right-wing. And if you argue with it, you have to fight against the kind of miasma of how can anyone conceivably say that this is a left-wing government? I just give you that as an example. Conventional wisdom on almost any subject, the formed opinions of the political class and the political commentariat, examined for a moment, will turn out to be untrue. But people don't examine it, because who is there to examine it? All the insiders all agree. They all agree because it's a consensus. The consensus on everything is the consensus of the centre-left, or the centre-right, which is identical to the centre-left. And there you have an entire set of agreement based on a falsehood, accepted by everybody, preventing any kind of thought. Well, let's start with sexism, all right? When I was working for the Daily Express, before it was taken over by that publisher of adventurous materials and controller of even more adventurous TV stations, Richard Desmond, I was sent a form to fill in to do with our use of the internet. And I was required to sign something saying that I would never do anything which was sexist. I thought, I'm not sure about that. And I sent it back to the person who sent it with the note saying, I refuse to sign this rubbish. Nothing happened. Nobody tried to enforce it. That was it. It was the last I heard of it. And I considered how many things I had done that previous week which was sexist. And I realized that if I had not discriminated very carefully between men and women on at least 40 occasions, I would probably have been locked up. I'd certainly have gone into the wrong lavatory. And in general, it would have been very foolish. Everybody discriminates between the sexes. Constantly, ceaselessly. Men do it, women do it. And yet we're required to pretend, for the purpose of ideology, that discrimination between the sexes, which are different, is equivalent to discrimination between people of different colour who are exactly the same. And it just seemed to me to be an outrage and an abomination that the two things were linked and listed as equivalent. I thought that Mr. Powell's speech on the River Tiber was appalling, inflammatory rubbish, and I still do. And yet nowadays, quite a lot of people tell me that they think I'm a racist. What happened to me? Did I suddenly mutate from being someone who thought that Enoch Powell was a reprehensible demagogue, stirring up racial hatred, into a racial bigot? No, I didn't. My opinions on that remain absolutely and completely the same.